welcome to Ask a Pastor. Today I'm joined by Mike Hatch, who works as one of the pastors on our staff here, Jenette, Cline, who does a great job with our student ministry, girls discipleship at our Wexford campus as well. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Just as we get started, we were talking just a moment ago about clothes and how you guys manage and navigate them. Mike, tell us, you have a system of putting every shirt next to the other one that you wore and then recycling them perfectly.
You gotta be careful the things you talk about before you start recording.
I'm just curious.
You bring it back to him, though, after.
I will, because you keep track of your clothes, too. Yes, that's right.
I'm the girl that doesn't, actually, so this is kind of funny.
Yeah,
I've
got my shirts lined up in my closet so that I don't have to worry about which one next to pick. I just go to the next one, and I organize them in such a way that they're,
So you don't have to think about it. Just go choose the next one up. That's the shirt.
Yep, unless I'm picky that day. In which
that
case
works pretty
right.
well.
Yeah.
And Jenette, you have a no ironing secret. I
do.
understand.
You just got to take it right when it gets out of the dryer, and then you never have to iron.
So do you hang it up right away?
Yeah, I
Don't
have
you get
a
the
huge
little
closet.
things in your elbows or in the shoulders?
Sometimes you got to push it up so that it doesn't get it, or sometimes if you turn it inside out.
Really?
Depends on the shirt.
Okay.
Random
the inside-out dryer. That's, value added today. Value added.
Hanger.
Well, on Ask a Pastor, we like to address current issues. Sometimes they're questions that you ask. Sometimes they're things that we thought would just be significant. And today, we wanted to talk a little bit about what it means to balance life with the economy. And here's what we're thinking about. As COVID has kind of started to subside a little bit, not clear where it's all headed, but as it's subsided a little bit and things have opened up, one of the questions that has been asked repeatedly is, how do we value life versus economy? If the virus continues to spread and people die, aren't a few people who die too many? And then on the other side, people will say, well, we have to live life and open the economy. We can't live in a constant state of sheltering in place. And so what we want to do is, just from a Christian worldview, ask that question. And really behind this in part is this idea that we make those value decisions every day. We could eliminate traffic accidents and deaths from traffic accidents if nobody drove anywhere. But obviously we couldn't live that way and have an economy. And so somewhere there's a trade-off, and the question is, how do we make those philosophical decisions? So Mike, please enlighten us. Tell us how this works, especially as one who is passionate about economic issues and life.
Yeah.
Tell us how should people think about this, and then especially from a Christian worldview. So you're going to wish you had taken the chance to host.
Okay, so first of all, something that helped me most recently to kind of write my perspective a little bit on this, and I think this is a good perspective. I was at the doctor yesterday to get an antibody test, actually, because I suspect that I could have very well had coronavirus in December. May not have been, but some of the symptoms are
looking
very
for my
similar.
mask.
Yeah, right. So I went to get that, and I talked to the doctor, and he said the last time he remembers an issue where there was a novel virus like this that was spreading and causing such controversy was probably the AIDS epidemic. And he said at that point in time, you have to remember that there was a lot of misinformation and interesting perspectives, and people taking all sorts of weird. I had my wife's relative built an in-ground pool in her backyard because she didn't want AIDS to be transmitted through the public pools. You know what I mean? Some of those crazy things.
But if you were alive back then, you're of age to remember, those were things that people actually thought. You'd get CDC guidance that would come out and say, be careful of these things. And so kind of like this, where first it's don't touch anything, and now they're saying, hey, touching isn't necessarily how it's transmitted.
Right. And that was the doctor's point, was we're still learning about this, and we're still trying to figure it out. And it just helped in my mindset to just, the difference is, though, the social media today is playing a much bigger role in kind of causing the division a little bit. And there's I mentioned to you earlier that I think people are siloed in their a lot of their information or news sources. And so we don't necessarily, I mean, sometimes you mentioned you try to get different sources from, or different information from different sources, but most of us have that one silo we typically go to, which makes it even more difficult to have the conversation. Either way, I just say that because to me it helps me understand, okay, this is not a new situation. We've faced this somewhat before, although it is challenging. I'll just, bottom line for me, from an economic standpoint, because you're right, the trick is, how do you balance not completely crashing the economy, yet being safe and caring for people's health? And that's a tricky situation to be in. I think if I were to, hindsight's 20/20, but if I were to go back, I would say from the very beginning, as this thing was starting to spread, test as many people as you possibly can, get a gauge of what is reality in terms of who's affected and who's not, and masks for everybody, and then go from there. But again, that's that's my personal take on it, and hindsight is 20/20 looking back. So, yeah.
Okay, so, and I think the question behind the question is really, how do we determine when a risk is a acceptable level of risk? I mean, you get on an airplane to fly somewhere, you take a risk. You say, oh, this airplane could crash. Well, it's a worthwhile risk. I need to go here for business. I want to go here for pleasure. I'm willing to take the risk. You hop in a car, as we said, you take a risk. And so I think that's the question is, and especially for policymakers, our government officials, it's been a really tough spot, because people, if they go on either side of it, assume that they don't care about life or don't care about small business. And the answer is, we have to care about both. You have to care about people's economic well-being and physical life. And it's unfortunate that we politicize things so much that people want to just throw stones at people on either side, rather than simply saying, we all need the same thing here. And so how do we find our way to that? And again, what I'm asking is there any way that you can help us think about it that would give us a question to the underlying thing? Jenette, what have you thought about as you've had a chance to think about this?
I definitely have a lot of questions, and I don't have all the answers, but there's a couple of things that just keep coming to mind. And one of them is just from 2 Timothy 1:7, and just that idea that God doesn't give us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And looking at how we make decisions and why we make decisions, if we are making that based out of fear, I don't think that is a good place to be or a healthy place to be. But as in everything, like you're saying, there's that balance of, like, if I am terrified of getting in a plane because I have that fear, is that rational? Is that balanced? Is that good? No. Is that healthy? No. But I think that, coupled with the verses that talk about loving your neighbor as yourself and thinking towards the good of others, and there's a balance that goes there. Like, I know I have struggled through that of, with things opening up and me caring for people that have a very high risk. And so it's the balance of, where do I sacrifice, for me personally, and maybe me not go out and me not do these things. And by doing that, I am loving this other person. But I think there's that balance in it between living in that mind, not of fear, but of power and love and of a sound mind, looking to, I think, the governing authorities. I think Romans 13 speaks a lot to it too. The governing authorities that God's placed over us are there to help make these decisions, respecting what they're advising and really going with that. But it's hard, because it's something that I think we need to take very prayerfully as we move forward, because how I feel about the situation and about the topic, as you guys can see in the media, is there's polar opposites. There's views, and if you feel this way, you hate this person. If you feel this way, then, But I don't think that should be the case or is the case. It's the balance of, yes, we need to move forward, but how can we do that in a loving manner that is going to love and care for the people around us on both ends? It's not one or the other. I think it's both. And so there's not a clear, straight, set answer for it, but weighing out kind of all those things and balancing them, which is difficult.
And I think you bring up a good point that you mentioned too, Kurt, was the politicizing of everything. And I agree with all that you said. At the same time, I know that God's very clear in Scripture, especially as he dealt with the Israelites and them asking for a king, and God's clear warning about, okay, look, if you have a ruler over you, this ruler is going to take advantage of you. He's going to enslave you in certain ways. There's going to be corruption. There's going to be some terrible things that come out of that. And it's interesting because I think we're seeing in the way this has been handled to some extent, I just feel like this needs to be at least said or identified, just that those in leadership over any nation tend toward corruption, tend toward self-centered agendas, and unfortunately, I think we're seeing a fallout from that to some extent in our culture today based on how they dealt with it. So while, yes, I do think we're supposed to in a sense, be obedient or I don't know if that's the right word, but
I think
respect the authorities. Mm-hmm. Yes, right. At the same
submit at points, right?
Yeah, yeah. At the same time, I don't want to be naive to the fact that there are some real agendas being driven right now that are sinful and corrupt, coming from our government and ruling authorities. And which should drive us to be even more dependent on Christ, more dependent on God, and making sure he's in that place of authority in our lives so that we are living out of faith and not fear.
Well, this in some ways gets to the heart, I think, of the Christian question. If you're a person of faith, which that's obviously our perspective, here's what Romans 13 says. Verse 1, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. That's pretty clear. The challenge comes when you say, I don't respect the authority, I don't believe that they're acting reasonably, or if it counters something that God's commanded us to do somewhere else. I think you could go to Acts and the whole we must obey God rather than man account that says when there's a clear command from God and your governing authority tells you to do something differently, you can say, I choose not to obey you because I'm choosing to obey God. Certainly, the civil disobedience of the civil rights movement would be an example where they say, we don't feel that segregation is a system that we need to obey because it causes us to compromise another value. And so the question is, I think, when and where do those things merge in terms of that? And then the philosophical question, probably apart from faith, is risk reward. I have a couple teenage sons who've gotten into cliff jumping and rock climbing and some of these things. And they're kind of, at that age where they do some things that as a parent, you're thinking, I don't know if that's the smartest thing.
That's fantastic.
And the conversation I have with them, my wife has you shouldn't do it, don't be stupid. I always try to have the risk-reward conversation. Like what is it that you're gaining from this? And what's the risk? Like, what could go wrong? Is that jump worth, okay, you get higher. At what point do you say that's not worth the risk? And try to have them, and I think, philosophically, for the governing authorities who are trying to make the decisions, that's the question that they're trying to balance and say there's a risk reward here. And I think as a Christian, our duty overall is to say, I'll be subject to that unless it's in a place where what they're asking me doesn't
kind of compromises
gel
your
with
faith. Scripture
or my understanding of that.
Yeah.
So, for example, a lot of churches have said, we have the right to meet, even if the government tells us we don't. I agree with that. I think there's a right for assembly in our Constitution. I think in the protests/riots, you're seeing the right to assemble that says even if there's a limit of 250 in some states, it's way more than 250 that are assembled. And people are saying, well, that's a right. And they're correct. I would say the same thing's true for church. However, like at our church, we've said, at least at this point, we're going to try to work in the confines of what our government has asked to try to participate in the greater good and say we do have other things that define us as a church other than simply meeting. Now, that's not to say we would always go there. If restrictions became, in our minds, excessively restrictive in some way, then we would probably say, okay, we need to exercise our right. And that's probably a whole nother conversation than this. But I think it plays into the thinking.
Yeah, and so one thing, and I may ask you about this, Jenette, with regard to this, because you mentioned the rock climbing analogy with your sons and calculating the risk, and the tricky part is it's not just calculating the risk to you personally; it's calculating the risk to others that you might be affecting in some ways. And the reason not that I'm taking your host job, I'm just curious because I know Jenette, Jenette has a perspective on that, just you personally with your family.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the hard thing for me, because when you look at taking a risk, the question is at whose expense? Like, if it were just me living, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, like, if I were not caring for people who are very high risk right now, I would honestly, and this is sad to say, but have a very selfish view of what I would do. And I would probably be living very differently than I am now, because taking a risk for me it's not just affecting me, it's affecting my family. It's affecting my grandma, it's affecting my aunt, it's affecting anyone that comes into contact with them. And so that's the difficulty of my actions don't just affect me, and they affect a lot of other people. And that what often borderlines fear of, could I potentially be hurting them or harming them by choosing to do something? And so that's the balance there. And that's why I think it gets at the heart of the issue a little bit too, is it's not just about me. And I think it reveals a lot of selfishness in me, in our society, in our culture of, I'm wanting to storm ahead, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do this, but the thought isn't the love your neighbor as yourself. Like, what if I was that neighbor that has that high risk? Or what if I were to spread something to my aunt or to my grandma? Like, would I want to live with those consequences? Like, no. And so that's the hard part for me of the risk of, where's the balance, where's not living in fear, but yet my actions affect so many other people right now outside of me and my world. Because if it were me and my world, I would just storm ahead and be like, let's go. Like, I don't care if I get sick. If I meet Jesus, I'm happy, I'm good. Like, but it does change, because my choices very much, and our choices very much, are affecting other people in how we handle things and how we move forward. So,
see, and as Christians, I think that's so important to keep that in mind, because we have to kind of separate our maybe our political views in some sense, or what we're thinking that maybe agendas are being driven, and hopefully be more gracious and generous toward others in terms of where they are with this. So, and I just give you an example. So I was, admittedly, I was one of the first ones to start wearing a mask. And I remember the stares I got. I remember being in stores and having really just, people just not looking at me as if I'm a terrible person. Or even approaching me and saying,
then it flipped. And then it was the people without the mask were getting the stares, right?
Yeah, right.
It's so
and
true.
now, it's funny. I walked through stores. I remember I was the only one wearing one. Now everybody is. But it's interesting because, so when we look at what somebody else decides to do in terms of their reaction to it, I think we need to just be gracious with them, and understand that there are reasons that may be fearfully motivated, but there may be some faithful reasons too. Like, I don't necessarily think you're, Jenette, wearing a mask and being cautious, especially when you've got people who are vulnerable. I don't think that's a fear. I think it's more of a faithful...
It's an act of love.
Yeah, it's an act of love, because you are, as we've talked about, and you're going to have to remind me of the passage, it's escaping me, but Paul's message about not causing another brother to stumble, and that sometimes we need to forego our own liberties.
Yep.
Right? Looks like you were...
I was going to say Romans 14 was the other kind of passage that came to mind with that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and certainly I think that's true. I also believe that, and this is not necessarily, this is more probably political in a sense. I think there's some wisdom to also saying we needed to legislate some things, but then you also need to let people choose at some point. Like Like as I look at small businesses that have just gotten crushed, and you think of people who've put their life into building a business, and at least where we live in Allegheny County, where there were so few cases, to have us shut down as long as we did and cost those people, in many cases, their actual businesses. Like I know people who aren't opening up a business that was open. That's hard because they were forced, rather than saying, hey, if you have reasons to stay home, if you're concerned about it, stay home, but let other people go about making their choice. I mean, that's part of what freedom is it says, if you're concerned, then you can stay home. And I realize not everyone has that choice economically, but again, that's not a unhistorical reality, that people are always having to make a choice. I mean, you think about people who are coal miners in West Virginia. Well, that's a risk-reward decision. Somebody says, you know what, I'm going to do this because it earns enough money for my family. I'm willing to live with the risk of whatever this does to my lungs and my life. And so again, I think we make risk-reward decisions all the time, every day, all day. We do that without even realizing it. And this is really just a much bigger case of those decisions that we make and need to make as part of living and being human.
And you're right, though, giving businesses the freedom to some extent, eventually, to do how they see fit. I think most businesses, too, would be sensitive to the issue. And like I know, for example, a coffee shop that I frequent often and love, Convive Coffee Shop, they changed their way of doing business where it's shut, you don't go in, but you can go through an app now, order a coffee. Right. They're masked up, gloved up, and they stick the drink outside the door. It's a pivot in such a way.
At some point, if you don't do that as a business, people won't come because they'll come to what they're comfortable with. And if they aren't, they won't come. And so the free market will dictate who will do business and who won't at some point. And what we did in this is and again, this is, I think, unfortunate. We said it's safe to go to Walmart and Home Depot and, Sam's Club, Costco, but not to Convive Coffee, unless you pivot and do a service differently and so on and so forth. And I just, there's huge loss there for our economy, for a lot of people. And I think, again, that gets to the core somewhat of the philosophical question. Biblically, again, it's hard, the Bible both values life and it values prosperity. It values human thriving, well-being, commerce. Those are good values in both strands in the Bible. And so it is a challenging issue. And again, I think our government officials have been put in almost an impossible situation of trying to make decisions within accurate information, as you said at the beginning, and say, okay, how do we do that? What words would you guys have for people as they have to make their own decisions now about, because things have opened up enough now that people are no longer able to say, hey, the decision's been made for me. So how would you encourage people to assess risk reward as they look at this? Jenette, why don't you go first, then Mike?
I would say, and I don't know that this necessarily answers the exact question that you're asking, but what comes to my mind is still that loving your neighbor as yourself, not just basing your decision upon yourself, but looking outwards towards others and how that's going to affect others as well. And just really coming at it with love and with prayer, and with what you're comfortable with. Eventually things are going to change, and like anything, I feel like even with me, it's been a baby step here, baby step here. Sometimes I'm pushed into it and I don't want to, but prayerfully seeking and checking myself mentally. Am I making this decision out of fear? Am I making this decision based upon, the information, the knowledge that we have, what's been recommended? Am I making sure that I'm still looking outward and making sure that I'm protecting and loving others, or am I just making it based on me? So those are kind of what rolls around in my head as I'm looking forward to making decisions about it. But I think that's something that each person should consider as they're figuring out what that next step is for them.
Okay.
Definitely, yeah.
And Mike?
Yeah, I would say don't die on your ideological mountain. We as Christians, our allegiance is to the kingdom of God, not to the kingdoms of this world. And I think often, I've just seen this, and this relates to the race issue too that's been exploding right now too. I think we need to stop and just lay your agenda aside and just listen. Let's understand seek to understand versus seeking to prove your point. I think we put too much stake, many of us as Christians, in those mountains, as I just said, those proverbial mountains, and not enough in the gospel. And I think let's not be quick to judge. Let's not be quick to assume people's motives based on what you see them do all the time. Let's seek to understand and bring the gospel to bear in each situation. And I guess that would be my statement.
Well, good. Well, thank you both, and thank you for spending part of your day with us. And if you have questions, please send them to askapastor@orchardhillchurch.com, or a topic you'd like us to address. We'd love to address it in a coming episode. Have a great day.